Hello, church family. I want to share with you about total surrender. When I was a young man, I watched a movie called The Princess Bride. And there was this young man who was had fallen in love with this beautiful young lady. His name was Wesley. Her name was Buttercup in the movie, if you've never watched it. And he was pursuing her heart, but he came as just a servant boy to win her heart. And she took advantage of him to really test his love. And she would just put him through the ringer and make him do all kinds of different things, but she could never get him to despise her. He always surrendered his will to her and did it joyfully. And I remember one time in the movie, there was a pot hanging right above her head, and she said, "Servant boy, come get me this pot right here." And he looked at her with eyes of love and said, "As you wish." That was his famous line throughout the movie. He would just say, "As you wish." And he was surrendering his will joyfully out of love. It was because of his love. He found joy in pleasing her. It wasn't this painful thing that he had to do. It was joyous to him because he was pleasing the one he loved. It reminds me of what Jesus said so clearly. He said, "If you love me, you will obey me." He just says the outworking of that love will be a desire to please me, and it will actually bring you joy, and it will work out in your life that you obey me consistently because of your love for me. Obedience is the joyous surrender of your will to the one you love. You know, I used to say obedience is doing what you're told, when you're told, how you're told, where you're told, with a good attitude. But the more I really studied it, obedience is primarily the joyous surrender of your will followed by these outward things. And so at the core of obedience is the surrender of your will joyfully, because it says God loves a cheerful giver. On the other hand, disobedience is really a stubborn disposition of heart, is what it is. It's an act of pride and a statement of swollen self-love. It's equivalent to mutiny on a ship. It's trying to rule our own life, throw God out of his throne and say, "I want to be in charge of my own life, and I would take over this universe if I could." But when we fall in love, truly love Christ the way he deserves and wants to be loved, it is our joy to surrender our will to him as our love continues to grow. Once we love him more than ourselves, we find great pleasure and joy in making him happy, actually pleasing him by surrendering our wishes and our ideologies and thoughts and goals and plans and stubbornness to him and saying, "God, give me a willing spirit." It's a gift that God gives. He says, "You have not because you ask not." So I would challenge you, if you struggle like I have throughout my life, just being stubborn, really it's just using the faculty God's given you and the blessing that he's given you of a will to purpose to do what's right and setting it against those things and against him and using it stubbornly to fight everything he's trying to do. So without true surrender, we will not experience his presence, and there will never be satisfaction for our thirsty souls. Thirst is the body confessing its needs and desire for water, which should move beyond recognition of that fact that, yes, I am thirsty, I am hungry, into an action towards the source of your ultimate satisfaction. So once we recognize that our body is thirsty and we acknowledge that and we confess that, it should move us to move towards the source of satisfying that desire. Listen to what Jesus says. He says, "If anyone thirst." Are you thirsty? He says, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink." And later he says, "Come freely." You can buy this food and water without money. He just wants a surrendered will. Jesus' constant call, his constant call is to come to me, to come to him. He's desiring that you would do that all the time. John Piper said this. He says, "God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him." I want to just share with you a guy that's really been influential in my life over the last 5 years or so, just in teaching me to be more intimate with the Lord. His name is Eric Gilmore. I don't agree with every piece of theology, maybe that we could have our little differences, but he has mentored me so much in just seeking the presence and the pleasure of God's presence on a daily basis. And he says these words, he says, there is no pleasure of his presence without surrender. Just as sure as there is no resurrection without death. It's an impossibility to have a resurrection without a death. And it's also an impossibility to feel the pleasure of his presence and the joy that is overwhelming and unspeakable and full of glory without submission to his will. Perfect submission, perfect delight, is how the song puts it. The cost of total obedience is extremely cheap when we compare it to the cost of disobedience. We are cast out of this presence, this tangible presence that we can sense his pleasure as we live a life in rebellion. God desires so much that we would live with a life surrendered to him in joyous surrender and experience his presence moment by moment. Speaking of so many around the church that are not walking in total union with God, Eric says, they have tolerated something that gives a small measure of religious satisfaction, yet stopping short of surrendering the whole of themselves upon the altar. This is called idolatry, when we don't give all to God for the sake of keeping something else. He also says, only those who by submission of their wills seek God as the sole source of their satisfaction of their souls, make God their God. So I would challenge you, is your will surrendered to God? Are you sensing the pleasure? That's a question I'm asking myself. Just the tangible presence of God, the smile of his favor, that I can experience his presence, the strength and the power and his direction of his presence. You know, there's a story that I've told the kids so many different times, but it is a story of a man named Caesar Milan, and he's known as the dog whisperer. And he goes to a situation once where this dog is biting the owner. And as he goes to this lady, he puts his hand, goes to pet the dog, and the dog won't bite him. But when he does it with the lady's hand underneath of his hand, the dog tries to bite him. And he takes the dog and he pins the dog down to the ground. And this lady just starts weeping. She's crying. And she says, you know, you're going to kill him. He says, ma'am, I'm not upset at the dog. I'm just teaching the dog. I'm just training the dog. And this dog literally was just going crazy trying to bite him. But finally, this lady says, you got to let him up. You got to let him up. And he said, ma'am, I can't let him up. Look at the dog's fur. The dog's fur is standing up. The dog's fur should be laying down. Within just a few moments, you see the dog's fur laying down. She says, let him up, let him up. His fur's laying down. He says, ma'am, look at the dog's tail. The dog's tail needs to be laying limp. And within just a few moments, you watch the tail go limp. And then she says, look at his tail. Let him up, let him up. And he says, ma'am, look at the dog's ears. Its ears are standing up. I can't let the dog up when his ears are standing up. They should be laid back. And you watch just a few moments, the dog's ears lay back. And she says, oh, let him up, let him up. And he slowly starts to take his hand off the dog, and the dog starts to jump up, and he pins the dog down to the ground again. And she says, what did he do now? He says, ma'am, the dog doesn't get up when the dog wants to get up. The dog gets up when I tell him to get up. And from that moment, you watch, just a few moments later, that dog lays there, and it's like a grin comes across his face as you watch him, the pleasure of just surrendering to a new owner, and then the freedom of being able to go out and be directed, not to bite everyone that touches him, but his whole life just opened up. He can go play Frisbee on the beach. He can go wherever, as long as he learned to surrender his will to his new owner. So I would challenge you, how is your life these days? Are you held captive by your own will, that you can't experience all that God is desiring for you, the pleasure of his presence? A true song of love and worship can only come from a truly surrendered heart. I felt like God gave me that the other day, just as I woke up. He just said, Steve, a true song of worship can only flow out of a surrendered heart. So offer God your will as an act of love and trust, and do it joyfully today, I pray. God bless you.